a little bit deeper into the common agricultural policy to make sure that we are all talking about the same elements here. Obviously, this is the EU's primary instrument shaping agricultural systems in Europe, impacting what farmers are doing, what landowners de facto are doing as well. Initially, when the CAP was established so many years ago, it focused on productivity, on farmers' income and market stability, but then we're talking about Europe after World War II rather than today. Now we're talking about increasing involvement of the needs of society and environmental objectives to be incorporated into the current conditions that we are seeing both outside and inside this room. But again, to fulfill the objectives that we can see on the right side of the screen, now with multiple objectives which actually cover the different elements in sustainability definitions, we still need to be able to lay out the evidence of whether the CAP is working towards the aims of supporting agroecology, biodiversity, ecosystem services, and those issues that Bertrand was showing, which are the consensus points of what agroecology is and what it is doing. So the starting point for us is to put the consolidated evidence on what are the CAP instruments doing for those instruments that have not been evaluated so far. And this starts with a literature review within practical problem. It doesn't work. Somehow it stopped responding. Now it does. Okay, thank you. He's a magician. So the first thing to do within Work Package 2 was a review on the effectiveness of the key CAP instruments towards agroecology, towards biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also looking into the literature on the barriers for expansion. Here we focused on those 5 category dimensions of agroecology that one can define as incremental levels of agroecological transformation. So we're talking about input reduction, water quality, soil health, climate change mitigation, landscape diversity, and wild species diversity, or what you call biodiversity. We took the last CAP periods, given the many changes that we've seen. It's not too relevant anymore to look before that, because you cannot really compare the different instruments anymore. So from 2007 onwards, we looked into 6 CAP instruments, and we look both into what you call ex ante and ex post assessments, meaning modeling into the future or evidence into the past, and only when they're really causal, only when they take these instruments and analyze them, not just hand waving about what the CAP should or should not be doing, but actual evidence of potential or actual performance. With this painstaking work that Lizzie Finch has been doing in the last years, we've been able to identify 56 publications for the effect of CAP instruments, with a range of 6 to 21 publications per instrument. You can see that there's some bias in terms of the coverage in Europe, so it's kind of good coverage but not excellent. And for the topic of barriers for effectiveness, we found 75 publications, or we used 75 publications. Here it was a lot more balanced. We found 6 to 30 publications per instrument, covering all member states. So with that, I'll try to guide you through the slides that Clelia prepared but cannot present here, showing the different dimensions that we're talking about. So on the left side, you could see the 6 different instruments: cross-compliance, direct payments, greening payments within direct payments, voluntary coupled support, agri-environmental climate measures, and areas facing natural and other specific constraints, or what you call ANC. And on the other hand, from the upper side, you see the 6 dimensions, or 5 dimensions, sorry, of agroecology that we identified. So input reduction, biodiversity, soil health, water quality, and climate mitigation. The first thing you see when you're looking at the total result, where you see the coloring of positive, negative, mixed effect in yellow, or no effect in gray, is that all in all, the total doesn't look very promising, because there is lack of internal coherence between the different instruments of the CAP, particularly the negative effect of direct payments taking 70% of the budgets. But pay attention that the number of publications is pretty marginal. So here we have this issue that we actually still don't know much about the biggest share of budgets of the CAP funding. The second thing you can see is that there's contradictory effects if you look across agroecological dimension of the same instrument. So for instance, for greening payments, which were promised to change the world, but greening is a verb and green is a certain reality that you either support or not, then what we can see is that there was not much of an effect of setting greening there, primarily because they didn't change much. So we have either mixed effects or negative effects on soil or other effects. So all in all, we have very mixed effects. Voluntary coupled support has been criticized in the literature for socioeconomic impacts, impact on trades, etc. But here we see also that it has very mixed effects, ranging towards the negative effects, as we would have also expected. The other thing we can see is the huge knowledge gaps we have, particularly on the soil health issue, but also for biodiversity, for cross-compliance, for direct payments. And some instruments remain unknown to us, like areas of nature constraints. And this was also one of the reasons why we are still analyzing, based on data, what is the actual impact of areas of nature constraints. The other part of the results in this case now is about the barriers. So for those reasons that we don't manage to expand or improve, what are the problems for the effectiveness? And here you see again, here you see the number of barriers that have been mentioned. And they divide into policy design and policy implementation, but also policy evaluation. And again, I need to guide you through the different instruments that you see. CC would be cross-compliance, direct payment is DP, greening payments, etc. And the first thing that you can see is that there is a distortive effect of the allocation criteria, which some people will call also equity issues that are another dimension in agroecology. So simply because some farmers get the money, others don't, and so we don't manage to give the support to those farmers trying to do best or to do better for biodiversity. So these biases are impacting performance, and in some cases, rare cases, but we can also show, based on the literature, that these distortive payments are a problem. The other problem is lack of transparency. In the lower part, you can see that Clelia was marking insufficient evaluation and data sharing. Basically, if you ask for EX data, you either get a no or ignorance, ignoring your emails or whatever else, or there's no monitoring at all, for instance, for pesticide use on agricultural areas. So even if you ask for the data, it doesn't even exist. The other thing we can see is that there's a big trade-off between the ambition of a certain instrument, the lack of spatial targeting, which we know is a major problem for environmental schemes, but also for cross-compliance. So there's a lack of coherence between ambition, spatial targeting, and administrative burdens, where the more a farmer wants to do agroecology, the more administrative barriers they're facing. And particularly, this is a big problem for agro-environmental schemes, which is very well known in the literature. So what are the recommendations when it comes to the CAP with this respect? First of all, to improve internal coherence between the different instruments regarding agroecology. Or as we heard earlier from the innovation hubs, as Camille said, you cannot say A and do B. You need to actually support what you're claiming to be supporting. The second is to maintain ambition for environmental social conditionality and to maintain basic standards. Currently, we are facing the risk of reducing cross-compliance, basically removing one of the simplest and most effective instruments that you have seen in the graph that occurs throughout with green, so having a positive effect on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and agroecology. We need to secure and increase the budget for spatially targeted agro-environmental measures. And this is really important because regardless of whether we have more or less money, using the same money in a more effective way and more targeted way will work better towards achieving our goals without adding more administrative burdens. And so we can find the ways to reduce administrative burdens, particularly for ambitious farmers that are trying to reach something. So for instance, whole farm applications can make life easier, or collective applications for group of farmers make it a bit easier for them. Innovative instruments, we'll come back to them in a few seconds, is another way. I'm not talking only about result-based ones. The other thing is the question of what is the role of the EU as a polycentric governance that we do have and we don't want to abort. And the point here is to strengthen the CAP's polycentric governance to provide flexibility for farmers to do the right thing, to adapt to local conditions, but also to maintain ambition. And this will require clear goals, a causal assessment, not just where do we put the money, but causal assessment of the performance of the instruments and adequate indicators towards the expansion of agroecology. Which brings me to the second part of Clelia's presentation on indicators and the work that has been done together with innovation hubs across all 11 innovation hubs, and also the policy brief, which is laid on your chairs, which Clelia was ferociously finishing ahead of this event, about the issues of indicators and how the EU is using indicators towards agroecology. Now, the questions we're basically asking is whether the indicators used in EU policies are matching with those indicators that are considered by scientists to be effective and used by practitioners to actually evaluate what is happening on the ground. So what is the method here? First of all, we identified 28 different themes within the scientific literature relating to the 4 dimensions or the policies that we heard before. So we have the farm socioeconomic performance with examples like resilience, profitability, etc. We have the biodiversity dimensions, the obvious dimensions like community structure, abundances, diversity, etc. We have climate change mitigation being very important for avoiding a worse future. So we're talking about carbon storage, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Climate change adaptation, meaning how we adapt to changing conditions, for instance, by different pest regulation, soil health, etc. So what are we actually doing to adapt? So these are the themes that we're talking about. And now the task was to compare the 82 indicators that were found within the 4 policies that I mentioned earlier, the CAP, climate law, nature restoration regulation, and the soil monitoring law, and then compare them to the 67 indicators that were listed through a very complicated procedure, which was published and described actually by Cecilia earlier. So basically we have those used by practitioners and tried within the areas in the 11 innovation hubs. And when we are comparing them, we can look for 4 different types of mismatches. Either there's a theme mismatch, which basically means we have an indicator in one place, but it doesn't exist in the other at all, so the topic is missing. For instance, there's no policy indicator for pest regulation. Indicator mismatch, meaning we are talking about the same issue, but we're not using the same indicator. So you might look at ants or look at weeds. You cannot compare these two. Problem. The third problem could be a mismatch in definitions. So it sounds like the same theme. It sounds like the same indicator, but de facto, if you actually look into the definitions, then the policy indicator on earthworms uses diversity, but practitioners are actually looking at abundance when they do it in the field. So the definitions are actually not the same, and this means that it cannot be translated from one to the other. And finally, it sounds very much like a nitty-gritty of details, but the scale matters as well. So if there's a scale mismatch, whether you measure something at the national or regional level or the field level is a big difference. And if these is mismatching, we have another problem where you actually can never use it. Example, high nature value farmland definitions in science practitioner or soil organic carbon and where you measure it. So with that in mind, now let's look at the 4 themes in different colors that you see here. So biodiversity in green, climate change mitigation in yellow, climate change adaptation, and socioeconomic performance. And now let's look at the outside part. And what you see is basically that policy indicators cover 25 out of 28 of the relevant themes. So we already have 3 themes that are not covered at all by the policies: genetic composition, species traits, and temperature regulation, completely missing. Then practitioners used 21 themes, so we have some mismatches there. Within the 20 themes covered by both policy indicators and practitioner indicators, we have 18 themes that are covered by different indicators. And within the 17 themes covered by similar indicators, 15 were covered by policy indicators calculating using different definitions, and 17 themes were covered by policy indicators but measure at different scales. All in all, when we put that together, there's no single one indicator that has no mismatches from beginning to end. This is lack of policy coherence. From a scientific perspective, this is completely resolvable. From a pragmatic perspective, completely resolvable, but this is not how the current European policy is working. So basically, all of the 28 themes are suffering from one or more mismatches, leading to the fact that you cannot actually evaluate current policies along the 4 policies we're talking about. So what are the conclusions and recommendations laid out also in this policy brief? First of all, the current indicators used in EU policies are not adequate to cover the multiple dimensions of agroecology. The second thing is we need to urgently enhance the ability of the EU policies to support the expansion of agroecology by adding the missing indicators. Yes, we need to add indicators, and we need to revise 6 existing indicators. And here in the table, which you can read later on, it's on the policy brief and will be online, of course, you can see which ones can be improved quite easily. This is not rocket science. This is basically working with scientists to implement the knowledge that is there. And why is it so critical? Because at the moment we're hearing about CAP reform moving towards result-based orientation. We're hearing about giving more flexibility for member states, but what does it actually mean? It means that we need to improve the capacity to evaluate performance. Without a full match between the aims and the performance, you actually cannot do that. And this is why, particularly now, closing these gaps is absolutely imperative. With that, you can support agroecology far more effectively and enhance both the transparency and people's trust in what the EU is doing and how it invests its money. Which brings us to the second presentation, second part of my talk. The previous one was by Clelia, the second one is by myself. And now we're basically asking somewhat different questions about this performance evaluation and what is happening at the EU level. So here, what we did as part of what was starting within the project as SWOT analysis and developed onwards into what we call an OTR analysis, we asked about opportunities and threats to agroecology, as well as the responsibilities, or if you want, the actors that are impacting agroecology either positively by trying to expand it or negatively by basically acting as barriers. So we're talking about opportunities versus threats. We did that at the EU level versus the innovation hubs. And this was done using interviews with over 50 different people, trying to ensure that they also cover different expertise. So policymakers, stakeholders, civil society experts, or scientists, and as balanced as possible within 4 innovation hubs that you'll see soon. And Marie Bézard is the one leading that together with Carolina in the WFZ and ourselves. And the approach that we have taken was to go systematically with each of these people in a semi-structured interview and go through what you call a pastel approach. So they had to tell us about the threats and opportunities within a political, economic, social, technology and innovation, environmental, or legal aspects. And because they did it systematically, we have the results for all 6 dimensions of the potential opportunities and threats. And to give you a quick overview of the results, first I want to start with the EU level, given that we're in Brussels, and asking ourselves, what do we see in terms of the map of opportunities and threats? And the coloring here is not good or bad, but rather a lot or few. So a lot will be red and few will be blue. Middle is the white, meaning that we see a lot of threats, particularly political threats, economic threats, but also social threats. We have fewer opportunities, and we also analyze the ratio between threats and opportunities, where you can see that the ratio is almost double when you're looking at political threats versus opportunities opening. When it comes to legal, for instance, we have a lot less, and when it comes to environment, we have to live with what we have. So it's neither an opportunity or a threat, but the reality, for instance. Interestingly, pay attention to technological and innovation, where some people said it's a bit more opportunities than threats, but I would say that technology was acknowledged by people as it's just there. It's not an aim, it's not a threat or an opportunity, but it's how you use it. And therefore, it's not very surprising that the result for technology consistently also through the innovation hubs is that technology is how you use it. So let's pay attention to what happens now within the innovation hubs. So here are the results from the 4 innovation hubs: Denmark, Hungary, France, and Guadeloupe. And the first thing that you can see is that in Denmark, there's an interesting situation where there's actually more economic opportunities than threats. So economic being the second one, and this is the only place where you find a red mark, meaning a lot of opportunities, partly because Denmark has been very ambitious in trying to support and even develop both the carrots and the sticks. They are the first country in the EU that also really put the sticks on greenhouse gas emissions and taxing. So yeah, we need both carrots and sticks, and Denmark is leading in doing that with a different unique situation of threats versus opportunity in favor of more opportunities. In France and Hungary, you see political and economic threats being the most dominant ones, also both on the threats versus opportunity and the threats. And Guadeloupe is again very unique in terms of the strength of the barriers that they're experiencing. We see economic barriers, we see legal barriers, especially legal barriers. If you see the threats versus opportunities, almost 7 times more. And basically, this means that the context for the outermost regions is really not suitable. The EU is not promoting the economic problems of simply how to survive on an island where you have no market access, you have no opportunities, economic difficulties, poverty alleviation being still a major issue within the EU. And so within this category, I think Guadeloupe really stands out as demonstrating how much the EU is not aware of its own diversity in terms of the tool that it gives towards supporting agroecology dimensions. Now the question is, how do we resolve that? So first we need to identify who are the actors operating. And here we can see the map that was created and finalized by Marie for the new version just 2 days ago, actually yesterday on the train. So these are absolutely fresh results showing in very little text. I'm afraid that it's very hard maybe to read. But you can see the different type of actors that have been mentioned by the interviewees in these different interviews. And we compare here between the EU level and the innovation hubs level, so the regional level, EU being particularly Brussels. And the first thing that you can see is that you see both blue and red. So the same actor can be both a facilitator and a barrier, or the same type of actors. So there's no good and evil in this game, but rather we need to think about what is the potential role of different actors. A second thing that is really interesting is the difference between the two maps that you see here, meaning that in the EU, we really have a very different map of actors doing very different things, including policymakers being much more on the red when it comes to EU, and policy implementers being much more on the blue when it comes to implementing and trying to do something positive, especially at the regional level. We see lobbyists very strongly at the EU level pushing against the farm industry is here as well on the red in Brussels. And for policy designers, or what you call politicians, you have a very mixed result with very different picture in different innovation hubs, different countries, and in the EU versus here. So we have a very mixed map of some working ahead, sometimes against, and when it comes to Brussels, a lot more against. So private companies are another problem that agroecology is facing, but it was very interesting to see a mixed result for the agro-food industry, having a much more positive role, at least perceived role, in the innovation hubs. So a potential opportunities that we might want to think about. And so when it comes to thinking about opportunities, maybe it's the time to invite a small intermezzo by Adrien presenting the policy briefs that emerged from the work in the innovation hubs on grasping and taking these opportunities.
Yes, exactly. So I'm here to present a production we had directly related to this question of expansion of agroecology. I'm Adrien Sortebroeks. I'm part of the Belgium team. I'm working in the Walloon Agricultural Research Center in Wallonia. And as you saw previously in the project, we really had those 11 innovation hubs, which really were key and one of our strengths in the project. And we wanted to learn from their own experiences and what they did in their own context. And so thanks to the work with part of my team, Pauline Cassard, which is not here, but Marie-Hélène Delove, which is here, we try really to have so a different type of way of having those information. First, we did some interviews in 11 innovation hubs, but also with initiatives outside of it. And we also made a survey. And so there were answers in 23 countries. And at the end, we really wanted to see So the key question, sorry, was really what helped them or what blocked them in their own transition. And so thanks to that, we write a policy brief with the idea that you wanted really to try to fill the gap between what we learn from those initiatives and so policy on the other hand. And so to give here some key points of it, as you can see first, the question of the awareness of agroecology, because a lot of the farmers mentioned, I don't see society around me that's aware of agroecology. So that was the one key aspect of it. Another aspect was the question of the long-term policy. A lot of those farmers, even if they agree, even if they wanted to do things, they say that it requires money, and I need to be sure that in 10 years or even 5 years, and we discussed it just before, we are sure that it doesn't change. Another aspect related to that is the idea of the financial support for the transition. Of course, we can argue that there is the cap, that there is already a lot of money that flows, but the question of the transition itself is important and how they get money for that. And the last aspect that we wanted here to highlight is the question of the labor condition and the young generation. When I go across Europe, and especially in the southern countries, there was a real question for the workers and to have workers that are, I would say, that have the skills to work in their farm. And so the idea was really to gap between with policy, so feel free to use it. It was on your share, or you can ask it to me. And yes, so you can also share it to, even if it's a policy brief, you can share it, of course, to other arena. Thank you.
So we presented this policy brief in Brussels in November 25. We hope that they will pick it up. Probably not. So please be proactive and take them wherever you think this is useful, because we're producing these policy briefs also for you in order to bring them to those that need to be listening to what we're doing. So now let's take a look for a moment at the farmers, because you may have seen actually in the other slide before that the farmers are actually trying to do better. Many farmers are trying to do better, but they need the support for that. So one of the questions that we've asked, that is led by Greta together with Gesche in the University of Rostock team under Sebastian Lechner, was actually how do farmers perceive different payment models that are innovative, like collective bonus or point system, cooperative model. And the two interesting things is that when it comes to innovation, as much as we talk about that in small rooms, as much as we're trying, most farmers actually don't know these instruments. So they're not familiar with these instruments. They hear a lot about result-based payments, but not much about other mechanisms. And on the other side, and this is even more important, they're pretty open to accept and to explore these interventions. And so a key issue is that it's not only about awareness, it's actually about allowing to explore these opportunities. And so this is a very important issue to take as the conclusions from this study, which was resubmitted now or submitted by Greta. First of all, that they do have a low knowledge of the opportunities, the map of opportunities for themselves, but high openness to change. There is no one size fits all. For a given context, as a given country, we will need to explore what are the opportunities. And co-design, which is so important in agroecology-TRANSECT, can really increase the fitness of the measure, the ecological effectiveness, and the uptake by farmers. And participation in such innovation schemes remains a major challenge. So they also mapped the issues for them. What are the barriers for them? And these are legal restrictions, administration as usual, economic factor, location factors, personal motivation, and societal norms. If they try to do something better, they might actually get comments from others or pushback from other farmers avoiding that. So the elephant is in the room, and the elephant is called the cap. And the main question is, under the current situation where policymakers are negotiating the next cap, the key question is, will the next cap deliver for agroecology, for farmers, for what we're calling them to do? So let's have a look at the current state of affairs. We at the moment have eco schemes. We can criticize them, of course, for being annual, etc., but they are there. We have agro-environmental measures. We have conditionality in the form that has been unfortunately reduced significantly recently, but we have a set of schemes. Even if you look at the division of money between different instruments, this is analysis that Sebastian Lackner was doing and is leading. We are currently revising this paper. In total, currently we have the largest sum ever in the CAP history, proportional towards agroecology, towards biodiversity. This is 15 million out of the CAP. Much of that is not very effective. We have smaller amounts of money that we can really define as harmful subsidies, and a very large share of the gray, of those areas that, as I've shown before, like direct payments, we actually don't know what is the direct effect on farmers, on agroecology, etc. But this is a relatively good starting point, which we could improve. On the other hand, we're standing against a big change in the multi-annual financial framework, or what you call the MFF, and this is already given, basically. So we are assuming that this will be accepted, taking many different policies, particularly the CAP together with the cohesion policy, and putting the money in one go. We are hearing a lot of shouting about we'll have less money. The reality, according to Alan Matthews and according to an analysis from Sebastian Lackner, will probably be, we cannot predict, but probably be about 15% less money. But this is not a huge cut, especially if you can use the money more effectively, which another paper was showing that about 50% is unused, or at least not efficiently. So what we did was to analyze the proposal that came from the European Commission, and we could come up with one conclusion which is positive about the putting of money together, which is finally we'll have regional money together for the regions. However, with a lot more people, stakeholders, and organizations that will fight for this money. So a lot more uncertainty, a lot more fights, insecurity, and complexity for farmers and for administration. Administration, I don't want to know how this is going to look like. The other thing is that was a decision to ring fence direct payments, the most criticized instrument of the CAP, that is failing for farm income, that is failing for division of payments, etc., is the one that we are ring fencing. Now, there are a lot of structural changes. We're losing the small farmers in red. We're gaining some big farmers. These are structural changes which are happening whether we want it or not. But the CAP has not been successful in stopping that. And the Gini coefficient of inequity for different parts of Europe, which you can see on the right side, is very stable over time. So the claim that capping and degressivity will solve these problems, given that capping and degressivity, meaning take from the big farmers to the small farmers, and with the leftovers of that, you can pay agroecology, you can pay agro-environmental schemes. We know ahead of time that this will not work. Partly because it will be watered down in negotiations as it happened in the previous reforms, and partly because it will not resolve the fact that direct payments are simply not an instrument to resolve the issues of incomes, fairness issues, or structural changes. It's just not a suitable instrument. The worst part in the news are the upcoming changes to the environmental perspectives. So merging eco schemes with agro-environmental measures is actually the only good news in the sense of, okay, why do you invent the wheel again in another place? But not ring fencing means that we don't know how much money will be remaining, especially when Ukraine is coming into the picture. Member states don't have the money. If you now add co-funding, which ranges between 0 and 20% now, to 30% for everything else but direct payments, you're moving to fighting over remnants of money for the rest, for rural environment, for farmers, for many other issues in the CAP. So basically, a very strong disincentive for member states to invest in agroecology. And now we're removing standards, which of course we're losing on all sides. We're weakening the simplest and most efficient mechanism for ensuring ambition in the future. So our conclusions on the CAP proposal is that it will worsen performance for agroecology without resolving the actual problems of the farmers. The reasons why farmers went out and demonstrated were not because of agro-environmental schemes. They demonstrated because the system is not operating for them. And this means that we are risking magnifying the frustration, magnifying the polarization in our society, and both farmers and taxpayers alike are going to be unhappy about that, which is eroding public support for these investments in the future. We might as well lose the CAP as a whole if this continues along this direction. So our recommendations on the CAP would be to phase out inefficient or harmful subsidies, redefining and improving the CAP objective for income, employing the public money for public goods principle, and helping those farmers that need help to do the right things. Meaning also helping young farmers, not generally helping young farmers, but to join on agroecology, to do the right things. We need to urgently find a way to convince policymakers to change the co-funding rule, which, according to a new analysis that Sebastian Lechner just completed, is probably the worst thing in the CAP proposal. And we need to employ a no backsliding principle, meaning don't lose what you have, because this is a risk for all of us under the current conditions of climate change and heat shocks, etc. So it's time to rethink and to think also beyond the CAP. If the CAP is not going to deliver, what else do we have in the Green Deal? We have the Nature Restoration Regulation, which unfortunately will also depend a lot on the CAP. On the other hand, we have the Omnibus Simplification Package, which was published in December 2025 by the Commission, which is basically deregulation of pesticide use. So when we're in this room talking about the need to reduce pesticide load from our water, from our food, when people are justifyingly asking for reduction of pesticide loads after the rejection of the sustainable use regulation, suddenly we're talking about deregulating, and that ensures even more pesticides in our food, water, and agriculture. Interestingly, in our paper that we just published in 2025, where scientists were publishing or debunking the misinformation around the nature restoration regulation and the attack on the sustainable use regulation, these are the same arguments that we are hearing currently. So this is already published in People in Nature. You can read the arguments against the arguments we're currently reading because it's the same arguments, and they are going against our society, against food, health, etc., and showing very limited ambition. Which means that we need to look even more broadly on how do we communicate with policymakers under the current situation of a polycrisis. We've done a literature review. We found 23 different crises on a global level operating across all scales in all countries, and they go far beyond agriculture. But agri-food systems are extremely central to the polycrisis. And interestingly, when we harvested also solutions, basically they are the same solutions that we've been calling for, which is a need of change in system design and intent, defining our goals better, because if we define the goals false, we cannot improve the system as a whole. So to summarize, the agroecology can deliver multiple benefits, but we need to identify the means to overcome systematic barriers. We have political, economic, and legal barriers that are dominating across Europe, and CAP is remaining the most important policy lever, but one that doesn't operate well enough and has the risk of worsening. And the current proposal is standing ahead of us, and it's a question of how can we improve that and improve policy coherence, particularly now to make sure that the nature restoration regulation is going to succeed, as well as the soil monitoring. To wrap up, we have recommendations here. We have a range of recommendations, but I wanted to focus today on the recommendations for policymakers, which is, first of all, to reform the CAP in a way that works for agroecology, meaning to phase out harmful or ineffective subsidies, to secure funding for sustainable transitions with, exactly as Adrien was saying it, with the transition in the core of this, and strengthen environmental transitions. We need to restore ambition, to realize that you will not manage to address the polycrisis unless you offer poly solutions, meaning win-wins for everybody, including nature restoration regulation, or even restoring the sustainable use regulation instead of the omnibus proposal. We need a food policy. If we want to care for the recipients of the food that we are producing, then the CAP will not resolve it. The nature restoration will not resolve it. This is maybe the time to ask for a food policy in Europe. And this can also happen across scale. The city of Leipzig adopted a point system and trying to develop a food policy. So if the EU does not deliver, we could also ask how the grassroots works that we're doing can come together. And finally, we need to find the ways to enable transitions, to raise awareness to agri-environment, as Andrea was saying, to support the young farmers towards this transition, to support innovating payment systems and explore them, to fund them better for a longer time, and to reduce administrative barriers for agri-environment and for people working in agroecology. With that, I finish my presentation, and we will move towards the panel discussion to allow also you to communicate with the panelists. Thank you. So with that, You'll have to bear with me onwards because I'll be also moderating this panel discussion. And with that, I'd like to welcome here three people that represent different perspectives on what we're trying to do. I need to change my glasses. Maybe I do it like this. So since my voice is a bit coarse, I was planning and asking you to send me your description, but instead I'd invite you to present yourself. So first of all, we have here Jure Chush from DG Agri, Unit C. We have Theo Paquet from EEB, the European Environmental Bureau, and we have Christina de Schamfelere from the PAN Europe. So I'd like to ask you first of all to introduce yourself, and then I'll come to the first questions to you.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here. I really enjoyed the whole day here. Learned a lot, so thank you for that. So as Guy mentioned, I'm Jure Čuš. I'm originally from Slovenia, working now at DG Agri in the geographical unit C4. So we are responsible for Slovenia, Croatia, Austria, and Germany. I myself am the desk officer for Slovenia, so I'm responsible for the Slovenian all rural development program, the current CAP plan, and also now working on the new programming period. So and before joining the commission, I worked at the Ministry of Agriculture and the paying agency where I was covering biodiversity related topics.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for having me here. So likewise, very, very interesting. Looking forward to read the policy brief because that's always easier to take on board than the scientific papers. So Theo Paquet, I work for the European Environmental Bureau in the Agri team. My work is very much focused on the Common Agricultural Policy. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Christine Schamfelare from Pesticide Action Network Europe. I have more a background in research. So for a while, I've been working more on land and water management studies, but now I work since some years for PAN Europe, among more on soil, on the CAP also, and also on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. And of course, now at the moment it was mentioned, a lot of our colleagues are also focusing on the current omnibus proposal of the Commission. Thank you.
So I'd like to start with a question to all the three of you, one after the other. So what do you actually see? You've heard a lot about the barriers and the problems, but what do you see as the biggest leverage for policy opportunities for expanding agroecology? So what's the, if you want, the elements in the policy map that, in your opinion, offer the best opportunities to expand agroecology?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think today already a lot of important elements were mentioned, of course, but to name a few, I think, for example, we can maybe talk a bit more on the omnibus later, but it's, of course, when it comes to pesticides, it also starts with really removing the harmful ones effectively from the market and also avoiding that harmful pesticides get to the market. And yeah, I focus here a bit on pesticides because it's our core work, but of course it has an important link to agroecology because one of the core aspects of agroecology is also to decrease harmful inputs. And we strongly believe, and scientific assessment and expert assessments agree with us that the implementation of the sustainable measures are also promoted, of course, by removing harmful inputs like pesticides from the market. And this really triggers the implementation, both the implementation of the good solutions already out there, as also development of other solutions. So we think that's a very important element. Then, of course, yeah, the CAP, it was mentioned, we have big worries about the current proposal. For us, it is key that the CAP is also really an essential tool to reduce pesticide use. So we don't think that public money should be used for harmful practices, and this includes, of course, intensive pesticide use. So the CAP should really be a key tool to support all farmers to reduce the dependency on pesticides. So this requires, it was mentioned, robust indicators. We also need much more transparent data on pesticide use. because it is actually obliged, for example, to register pesticide use. And from next year, also the digital registration will be mandatory. But what we really think is needed is to make this data available for everyone, for citizens, for scientists. So then this issue of pesticides also becomes much more concrete and spatially visible, like which exposure is happening where, also towards citizens. This is important to really drive the change. Now, everybody knows the issues with pesticides because it's clear in the collapse of biodiversity, for example, but it's not so clear what is used where, in what concentrations. And then, so for the CAP, we really think these transition payments will be important to funnel enough money to those, because we believe that it's good that farmers have flexibility and in changing their practices, but then this should be based on backup indicators. For example, for us on pesticide use, we think there should be a link then with concrete results on reducing pesticides. And a strong conditionality, of course. We also provided many recommendations on that. And then advisory systems, we really think, it was also mentioned, but that is something that always comes back in our talks with with farmers. They say that they receive SMS from the system in their country indicating to spray at a certain moment, while they themselves actually don't think it's needed. So we also need the advice to be really independent and really focused on agroecological organic practices. And then I think the NRL is for us also a key enabler, because it will not be possible to reach its goals without drastically reducing pesticide use. It's the key. It's one of the major causes in the decline of biodiversity. Most data are known on insects and bird populations, but for all organisms, they're detrimental also for soil organisms. So we hope the NRL will also be an important enabler. And then maybe just to finalize, also to show all the good practices out there much clearer to the wider society and policymakers. And of course, this project is excellent in doing that. But we do feel there's even more need to constantly show what the outcomes are of agroecological practices, for example, what the benefits are, to really counter this false narrative that we will get in problems with food security if we, for example, reduce harmful inputs, because it's of course the contrary. We need these healthy ecosystems to secure our food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just touch quickly on I was not planning on saying it, but you made a very good point on the indicators. And I think you presented quite you showed the big mismatch that there was. I think here there's a big opportunity in particular, because the main issue of the common agricultural policy, as you've highlighted, beyond the fact that direct payments are still the biggest share, is the fact that now there's no dedicated ring fencing for the environment and therefore agroecology. And the justification is that there is an overall target in the national regional partnership plans that 43% of that budget should be spent on the environment and climate. And how that 43% target is calculated is completely flawed for a number of reasons, but a big part of that is linked to the indicators. Unless you have very thorough and solid indicators, it's very hard to have a target that's actually going to measure the right things. So just wanted to quickly brush on that. Then maybe more broadly, in terms of biggest leverages for agroecology, the way I see it, it's what you've mentioned, the polycrisis. That's the biggest thing. Agroecology, and I look at it very much from the circularity angle. It helps reduce the amount of inputs. That's a very big part of agroecology, is you reduce the amount of mineral fertilizers you actually need. And right now we're seeing crisis after crisis, and we're seeing very short-term reactions. In the Fertilizer Action Plan, the Commission is indeed looking more in the long term. It has proposed short-term solutions, but also long-term one. So there's definitely work to be done there. But again, here in the short-term solution, they provide a lot of money for farmers to pay for fertilizers, but then they don't provide any money for farmers that are already reducing the amount of fertilizers that they use. So here, scope for giving money for the ones that are inherently more resilient is key. And yeah, maybe just on the CAP, completely agree. Transition schemes, we've mentioned we don't want new schemes. because it's always complicated to learn. But I think the transition schemes is a very positive one. It gives a positive message as long as they're designed well. So right now it's extremely vague. I think there's like 2 lines or 3 lines in the proposal, and it's talking about moving to resilient systems. Obviously, agroecology is one of those resilient systems, but it remains to be seen what happens in practice, and it will be up to member states if it survives the negotiation process to decide what it looks like.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Maybe I will continue on this one because I think, of course, CAP, as can we look at the CAP as the major instrument. And like you mentioned, this new, I would say, something new in the CAP is this transition payment. And I think this could be a very good opportunity because this is showing the direction. It is clear, like you mentioned, it is not very prescriptive in the CAP legislation, what is to somehow on purpose. So because now it's going to be in the hands of the member state to actually to prepare it and actually to adjust it to the the needs and the situation as it is in the member state. So what is very positive is that actually agroecological practices are mentioned. So this is I would say a very positive thing. But what I think now, what is something that maybe I plan to say that later, but what can be now, because now I think that the member states and the managing authorities will now need support. And this is where projects and project outcomes come and are super important because this is a new tool. So the managing authorities are usually, they don't have the capacity and they will look for suggestions, for ideas. And this is something that the projects like this can actually offer. So I would say this is something, this is the support that the member states and the managing authorities need, and we somehow need to and try to equip them with that. So
Thank you. In view of time, I was told that I have to finish actually quite soon, but I still wanted to ask a question to each of you. So I'll be happy for short answers. So first of all, actually to Yuri, I would like to continue on because you are speaking from within DG Agri. And so how do you actually see the CAP supporting agroecology expansion? So what is it in our work that in your opinion can be of greatest use for yourself inside DG Agri?
yeah, maybe I will not talk just from the DG Agri perspective, but like I mentioned before, I worked also at the Ministry of Agriculture. So this is now because I think we need to look from both perspectives. And that's why I said we need this somehow good example of good practices. So as you know, the Commission published, I think a month ago, a report on good examples for the agro-environmental from the current period, and that can be built on for the next programming period. And there was also mentioned a French scheme transition that is something similar to this transition payment. It's actually an agro-environmental climate commitment measure with a lump sum of 80,000 euros. And this is something that is very similar to this transition payment. So this is something we could build on. So I think this is something that also here, some good examples that needs to be or would be very helpful, that they could be somehow produced and showed. This is something that the Commission published, and it would be maybe even more helpful to select or use or map additional ones that could then help the member states to program it, especially we are talking about the transition payment as a new scheme.
I have different questions to different people. So I wanted to ask you, Theo. I mean, you're in EEB as an NGO, but also a member in La Feria. So what results is it that you actually need, or what's your main policy focus now?
So I think I will first echo what you said. I think getting more granularity on which schemes work well in practice, I think is the thing we need most here to do our actual lobbying or advocacy, whatever you want to call it. It's a dirty word now, lobbying, so I have to be a bit careful. So yes, so getting a bit more granularity. You had I think it was the first presentation where you showed that, for example, the eco schemes, they act on this and this, agro-environmental climate measures, it's positive on this or not. So maybe getting more granularity there on which schemes, because it all depends on how it's applied, and they vary extremely. Like the variance between member states is huge. So getting more specificity on this. And then the second one, and we touched on this in the La Feria project that I'll give a brief introduction on later, is the economic dimensions. Because this, I mean, in Brussels, if you're not talking about the economics, it's pointless. Talking about the environment at the moment is very much not the focus at all. It's all about competitiveness, food security, resilience. So framing your message along those lines and really making sure you have a solid business case for the farmers that are going into agroecology is very much key. And showing those different business cases is really what we need to be able to show that actually agroecology is not just, you know, we're hippies, etc., we're going backwards. No, it's a real project for agriculture in Europe.
Thank you. I'd echo immediately the issue on food security, which is also something we published in that paper that I mentioned, to say, okay, if you talk about food security, you need to talk about managing to produce in the future as well. So, Christine, you mentioned the omnibus proposal on pesticides, obviously. So what are actually your plans? Who are your allies to work on that?
Maybe I don't know how well everyone knows the omnibus here, but very quickly. So it was published at the end of last year, and the main aim is to deregulate pesticides authorization processes. Originally, it was meant to really accelerate the access to biocontrol, to less harmful alternatives, but in practice it then became really a proposal to undermine really fundamental safeguards in pesticide authorization. And so there's many elements to it, among more that very harmful pesticides that are banned can stay longer on the market afterwards. But the most key one is that for most pesticides, the periodic review would be deleted. So this is of course very difficult to comprehend for both the scientific community as civil society, because to regularly look again at the scientific evidence of pesticides, it's evident that it's needed. Insights continuously change, so you always have to update these data and then reevaluate an authorization. So these changes would really fundamentally change how both the environment and citizens are protected against pesticides. And so for us, looking also at the years before, at how loud actually civil society has been on the pesticide issue, it's difficult also to explain to citizens, because from the, I think, 8 citizens initiatives, in the EU, it's one of the main petition tools that citizens can use. 2 of them were on pesticides. So some years ago, more than 1 million citizens in Europe asked to exactly do the opposite, to much better protect against pesticides. And scientists have been doing the same for many years. So now, I mean, since the proposal, we have been really organizing ourselves among different NGOs on advocacy and campaigning. So Pan-Europe is most focused on advocacy. So what we've been doing is to analyze the proposal. We have urged different national organizations to send communications to their ministers, to members of the European Parliament. And we do think this can still have an effect, because we also notice that many politicians or policymakers are not necessarily fully informed on what the impact could be. And on the other hand, we are focusing now more on campaigning, because so in the council there will be a vote expected soon, then under the Irish presidency. And in the parliament, important votes will be in October. So we on the one hand, we will work with email tools that all citizens in Europe can use to put pressure. But we also need to create much more visibility. So like to really make it also in the streets visible. So we're also thinking of a march or a visible protest. It is, however, challenging, because sometimes citizens do have the feeling that they have signed already many petitions, and they think, how many times should we express that we find this topic key in all consultations? It's the same message from EU citizens. They think we need to reduce harmful pesticides, and we need to support farmers in doing so. So yes, our focus will be, of Pan-Europe will be highly on the omnibus together with other organizations, both and on advocacy and campaigning, and our allies, I think, are definitely also scientists, because we've been reaching out from the publication onwards to scientists, and there have been many statements. And so one of the most recent one is the article in Science, a very important, strong article that very clearly says how this omnibus proposal is not going to actually definitely reduce administrative burden, or certainly is not going to improve access to the alternatives, and on the contrary will definitely and fundamentally decrease the protection of environment and citizens. And the same message has been there in other scientist statements in France, the Netherlands, also in other international statements we helped coordinating. And we do think that this helps in really, especially if these scientists then also email to members of the European Parliament and to ministers, because we do hear then that they take this into account, and it's different than when a paper is just out there, than when they also get a personal message of scientists and citizens. Thank you.
Okay, I think our time is unfortunately up for the panel discussion. So at 5 o'clock we will be finishing. And therefore, I would like to thank you all, and we'll continue chatting. Thank you very much.